I was a CEO, a man of power and influence. My days were filled with multi-million-dollar deals and boardroom meetings. She was a 5-year-old girl, sitting alone, being mocked for her lunch of bread and water. I only sat down to be kind. I had no plan, no agenda. I had no idea that this one small act was about to unravel a secret that would connect me to her in a way I never thought possible, and change the entire course of my life. She was mocked for bringing bread and water to lunch, until I, a millionaire CEO, walked into the kindergarten cafeteria and sat beside her. The kindergarten cafeteria buzzed with the usual chaos of lunchtime, a symphony of clattering trays and high-pitched chatter. The air smelled of tomato soup and baked bread, a scent that was both nostalgic and completely alien to my world of catered boardroom lunches. I was only there for a routine trustee visit, a philanthropic duty my company's foundation required of me. My name is David Sterling. I'm the kind of man people notice, not because of any inherent charm, but because of the quiet authority that comes with running a multi-billion-dollar corporation. My days are a carefully curated schedule of meetings that decide the fate of millions. This visit was just another box to check. The school's director was leading me on a polite tour, pointing out the improvements funded by our foundation, freshly painted classrooms, new playground equipment. I was listening with half an ear, my mind already drifting to the conference call I had scheduled for the drive back to the office. Philanthropic visits tended to follow a predictable, sterile pattern, until we reached the cafeteria. I expected the usual scene of laughing, joyful children, but my eyes were immediately drawn to a still point in the swirling chaos. In the far corner of the room, a small girl, no more than 5 years old, sat utterly alone at the edge of a tiny table. Her blonde hair was parted into 2 neat, tight braids that framed a face far too serious for her age. She wore a simple yellow dress, slightly faded from countless washes. In front of her was a small plastic container holding a single plain piece of bread and a small bottle of water. I slowed my pace without meaning to, my focus narrowing entirely on her. I watched as her small fingers methodically peeled at the crust, not out of dislike, but as if the repetitive motion gave her a safe place to focus, a way to avoid looking up at the world around her. Across the room, at a table crammed with laughing children, I saw it. The quick, darting glances in her direction, the sly, conspiratorial whispers, the short, sharp bursts of snickering that made her small shoulders tighten, her back hunching just a little more, as if bracing for a physical blow. I didn't need to hear the words. I knew the tone. It was the universal language of childhood cruelty. The director was still talking beside me, her voice a pleasant but meaningless buzz in the background. Something in the scene before me unlocked a door in my memory, a door I had kept bolted shut for decades. Suddenly, I wasn't David Sterling, CEO, standing in a brightly lit cafeteria. I was a small, skinny boy again, sitting alone at a lunch table, my own stomach churning with the shame of a free meal ticket that marked me as different from everyone else. I remembered the weight of those stares, the feeling of being invisible and hypervisible all at once.
I realized I had stopped walking. The director paused, turning to me with a polite question I didn't hear. My gaze was locked on the little girl in the yellow dress. In that instant, the tour, the press releases, the very reason I was there, all of it became irrelevant. Without a word of explanation, I began to move toward her. Each step felt deliberate, heavy, as if I were crossing more than just a linoleum floor. I was crossing a chasm of 30 years, stepping back into a moment I thought I had long since outgrown and conquered. I had no plan, no carefully crafted words. All I knew was that some primal, protective instinct in me refused to walk past her, refused to be another adult who saw her and did nothing. I reached the serving line, and the cafeteria worker blinked in surprise as I, a man in a perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit, picked up a plastic tray. I scanned the options, loading my tray with pasta, a fruit cup, and a carton of milk. I wasn't hungry, but I knew I couldn't sit with her empty-handed. I needed to meet her on her terms, in her world. Tray in hand, I walked toward the far corner of the room. The chatter around me had shifted, the pitch lowering as dozens of small eyes tracked my movements. They were trying to understand the anomaly. Why was the important man, the visitor, walking away from the teachers and toward the girl they all ignored? When I reached her table, I set my tray down gently beside her small container. She looked up, startled, her large, serious blue eyes widening. Up close, I could see the faint paleness of her cheeks and the careful neatness of her braids, a testament to a mother who clearly cared, even if she couldn't afford more. I crouched down, bringing myself to her level, my voice softening in a way it rarely did, even with my own board members. "Hi," I said. "Mind if I sit here? All the other tables look a little crowded." She stared at me for a long moment, her gaze darting quickly to the table of children who had been whispering, as if checking for their reaction. When no new wave of laughter came, just a stunned silence, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. I slid onto the tiny bench, a giant in a child's world, and began to eat as if this were the most normal thing in the world. The children who had been mocking her were now watching us openly, their earlier smirks replaced with blank confusion. The power dynamic of their small, cruel world had been inexplicably shattered. I didn't start with questions. I knew she was a fortress, and I couldn't storm the gates, so I started with a story, a true one. You know, the first time I ever had to give a big presentation, I was so nervous that I accidentally wore two different colored socks to the office. One was black, and one was bright blue. I chuckled. I didn't notice until halfway through my speech. I was terrified everyone was staring at my feet. She looked at me, a flicker of interest in her eyes. "Did they?" she whispered. "No," I said, smiling. "They were listening to what I had to say." I realized then that most people care more about what's in your head than what's on your feet. She rewarded me with a tiny, shy giggle. It was a small sound, almost lost in the din of the cafeteria, but to me it felt like a victory. I slid a grape from my fruit cup across the table toward her. She hesitated, her eyes asking if it was really for her. I nodded. She picked it up with her small, delicate fingers and popped it into her mouth. The tension in her shoulders eased by a fraction. We continued to talk, or rather I did. I told her light, silly stories. She answered in short, soft sentences, testing the air. She told me she liked to draw flowers, that she had a favorite swing on the playground, and that her teacher was reading a book about a talking spider that she wished she could take home. I listened, not as a CEO fulfilling an obligation, but as a man who was genuinely, inexplicably captivated by this small, resilient human being. Halfway through, I took a risk. "Is bread your favorite?" I asked gently. She gave a little shrug, a movement that spoke of a weary acceptance far beyond her years. "My mom makes my lunch," she said simply. "Sometimes there isn't much to pack." She said it without a hint of self-pity, as a plain statement of fact, and that simple, uncomplaining honesty tightened my chest. As the lunch period ended, a teacher announced it was time to clean up. I watched as she carefully closed her container, leaving the last quarter of her bread untouched. She was saving it, a small, heartbreaking act of conservation. She slid off the bench and, for a brief moment, looked up at me. There was no grand transformation, no movie moment smile, but the fear in her eyes was gone. In its place was a flicker of something new, a cautious curiosity, a hint of trust. As she walked away to join her class, her two blonde braids swaying behind her, I stayed for a moment longer. The tour, the press releases, the very reason I was there, all of it had faded into the background. I had come to this school expecting to write a check. Instead, I felt like I had just signed a contract, An unspoken agreement with a 5-year-old girl that I didn't yet understand, but knew, with absolute certainty, I had to honor.
I caught up with the director in the hallway, my mind still back at that small table. The polite facade of the visit was gone. "The little girl in the yellow dress," I began, my voice direct. "Tell me about her." The director, a woman named Mrs. Gable, guided me into her modest office. She spoke carefully, her expression a mixture of professional concern and personal sadness. The girl's name was Lily. Her mother, Sarah, was a single parent, raising her alone. They lived in a small one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. Sarah worked 2, sometimes 3 low-wage jobs to make ends meet, cleaning offices at night, stocking shelves at a grocery store during the day. The bread-and-water lunch wasn't an anomaly. It was a recurring reality at the end of a pay cycle. I listened, my fingers pressed together, the story painting a picture I recognized with a visceral, gut-wrenching familiarity. My own mother, after my father left, had worked as a waitress and a seamstress. I remembered the smell of bleach on her hands when she tucked me in at night. I remembered her fierce, brittle pride, the way she would refuse help from neighbors, insisting we were just fine. "Does the school have a program for families in need?" I asked. Mrs. Gable explained that they did, but funding was limited. There were always more children in need than resources available. My jaw tightened. My company spent more on a single corporate retreat than this school's entire annual budget for student aid. The director added that Lily was a bright, sweet child, but painfully shy. The other children, sensing a vulnerability they couldn't name, often singled her out. The teachers did their best to intervene, but they couldn't be everywhere at once. They couldn't erase the quiet ache of a child made to feel small. When our conversation ended, I asked one more question. "Is there a way to help discreetly? I don't want the family to feel singled out or like a charity project." Mrs. Gable's eyebrows lifted in surprise, and she nodded slowly. "I can think of a few ways," she said. That night, back in the sterile silence of my high-rise apartment, I couldn't shake the image of Lily sitting alone. I could have just written a check. It would have been easy. It would have absolved me of the uncomfortable feeling her situation had stirred up. But it felt insufficient. It wasn't just about the food. It was about the isolation. It was about the quiet dignity I had seen in her as she saved that last piece of bread. My decision to help started quietly, invisibly. The next morning, I had my personal assistant wire a substantial, anonymous donation to the school's support fund. It was enough to fully fund free, nutritious breakfasts and lunches for every single child in that kindergarten for the next 3 years. No press releases, no photo ops. The point wasn't for me to be seen as a hero. The point was for Lily to never have a bread-and-water day again. But that was just the beginning. I knew that stability at home was the real foundation. Through discreet channels that my corporate resources made available, I learned more about Sarah's employment situation. It was a patchwork of unpredictable shifts and low pay. I didn't want to just give her money. That would be a temporary fix and potentially a blow to her pride. My own mother would have been mortified. Instead, I tasked my HR department with a unique project to create a new, legitimate position within my company's local administrative office, an office manager role with stable daytime hours, a fair salary, and full benefits, including health insurance. It was a role that perfectly matched the skills I had learned Sarah possessed. The job was posted through a third-party recruiter who was instructed to reach out to Sarah directly, describing it as part of a new community partnership initiative. She would have no idea that the CEO of the company was the same man who had sat with her daughter in the cafeteria. In the weeks that followed, as these plans were set in motion, I found myself thinking about Lily constantly. I rearranged my schedule, creating excuses to visit the school under the guise of monitoring the foundation's projects. I would see her on the playground, swinging a little higher than the other kids. I would see her in the reading corner, her small face a mask of concentration as she sounded out words. I never stayed long. I never approached her directly. I just watched. Each time I saw her, I felt that same inexplicable pull, a protective instinct I hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, I returned to the school with a delivery of art supplies for the entire class: sketch pads, colored pencils, watercolor sets. I remembered her telling me she liked to draw flowers. As my car pulled away, I caught a glimpse of her through the classroom window. She was holding a fresh sketch pad, her small fingers tracing the cover as if it were a precious treasure. At the end of the month, I received a quiet update from my HR department. Sarah Harper had been interviewed, excelled, and had been offered the job. She had accepted, crying with relief on the phone. For the first time in years, she would be home in the evenings to read her daughter a bedtime story. I filed the information away like a quiet, personal victory. I knew that money and resources could only do so much. The real wound I had seen in that cafeteria was isolation. That was a harder wound to heal, and I knew I couldn't do it from the shadows forever.
It was a Saturday afternoon when I finally saw the inside of their apartment. I had used the excuse of dropping off some final onboarding paperwork for Sarah's new job. She invited me in for a coffee. The building was old but immaculate. Their small apartment was the same, modest but filled with a sense of order and care. And on the wall, above a small bookshelf, were several framed photographs. My eyes were drawn to one in a simple wooden frame. It showed a younger Sarah, smiling, her arm around another woman, a woman whose face I knew. My blood ran cold. I stepped closer, my heart beginning to pound in my chest. The dark hair, the familiar shape of her eyes. It was my half-sister, Laura, the sister with whom I shared a distant, complicated father, and from whom I had been estranged for over a decade. The room seemed to tilt. I turned to Sarah, my voice barely a whisper. Who is the woman in this photograph?" Sarah's face shifted, a wall of caution and old grief coming up behind her eyes. "That was Laura," she said quietly. "My best friend. She passed away a few years ago." She paused. "She was Lily's aunt." I felt the air leave my lungs. Laura was my sister. Laura was Lily's aunt. That meant Lily was my niece. Sarah sat down, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug, and told me the rest of the story. Laura had been her chosen family, her sister in every way that mattered. After Laura's unexpected death, Sarah had been left alone with Lily. She knew about my side of the family, but she had deliberately chosen not to reach out. She hadn't wanted charity, and she carried a deep, simmering resentment toward a family she believed had been emotionally absent and neglectful of Laura when she was alive. In Sarah's eyes, keeping her distance was a form of protection for her daughter. I listened, the weight of her words a physical pressure in my chest. I couldn't deny her perception. My father had been a ghost in both mine and Laura's lives. Our extended family was a constellation of self-interest. But the thought that my own niece had been living just a few miles away, struggling while I lived in oblivious luxury, it was a profound, nauseating shock. I thought back to the cafeteria, to that strange, magnetic pull I had felt toward her. Had some part of me, some deep, instinctive part, recognized her? Recognized family? When I left their apartment that day, the world felt different. The discovery had rewired my entire perspective. Lily wasn't just a child I had decided to help out of a sense of compassionate duty. She was my blood. She was my family. My involvement in her life was no longer a choice. It was a responsibility, one that had been written into my own history without my knowledge. And now that I had found her, I knew, with absolute and terrifying clarity, that I could never, ever walk away. A full year had passed since that day in the cafeteria. The changes in Lily's life were like watching a flower bloom in time-lapse. She no longer sat in the corner, a small, solitary island. She was now part of the mainland, sitting at a long table with a group of friends, her laughter a bright, easy sound that carried across the room. Her lunches were no longer just bread and water, but colorful and varied, packed with the care of a mother who now had the time and resources to do so. My presence in her life had become a quiet constant. I was Uncle David, a figure who appeared for park visits, who brought interesting books, and who listened with solemn attention to her stories about school. Over time, her cautious uncertainty had been replaced by the open, trusting warmth of a child who feels safe. The question of how and when to tell her the full truth about our connection had been a constant, gentle weight on my mind. I discussed it with Sarah, and we agreed that trust had to be the foundation. The moment came when crisp autumn evening, walking through the park near her home. The air smelled of fallen leaves. She was holding my hand, chattering about a science project, when I realized I couldn't keep it a secret any longer. I sat with her on a bench and told her about Laura, my sister, her aunt. I spoke gently, simply. At first she was quiet, her small face scrunched in concentration. Then she asked, her voice a small whisper, "Does that mean we're family?" "Yes, sweetie," I said. "It does." She looked at my face for a long moment, then nodded, as if a puzzle piece she didn't know was missing had just clicked into place. She didn't say much else, but when we reached her building, she leaned into me for a hug that lingered longer than usual, a silent acknowledgement of this new, unbreakable bond.
Months later, I found myself back in the same kindergarten cafeteria where everything had started. The room looked the same, the table still small, the light still streaming in from the same high windows. But for me, it felt like stepping into another lifetime. Lily was no longer the solitary figure in the corner. She was at the center of a table, animated and engaged, her friends leaning in to listen as she spoke. When she saw me enter, she excused herself and came over, a sandwich in her hand. She sat down on the tiny bench beside me and, without a word, broke her sandwich in half, offering the larger piece to me. "Now it's my turn to share," she said, her smile carrying both a hint of mischief and a world of affection. The simple, profound gesture caught me completely off guard. It flooded me with the memory of that first day, of her sad, plain piece of bread, of the way she had tried to make herself invisible. Now here she was, meeting my gaze without hesitation, unafraid to take up space in the world, unafraid to share what she had. I realized then that my role in her life had never been one of rescue. It had been about creating the space and providing the stability for her to grow into the confident, generous person she was always meant to be. I hadn't given her a voice. I had just made the world quiet enough for her to feel safe using it. As we left the cafeteria together, her small hand slipped naturally, trustingly into mine. The path outside was lined with the first green buds of spring. My life had irrevocably shifted the moment I chose to sit down beside her. It had started with a forgotten memory of my own pain, a simple instinct to offer comfort. But it had become a journey back to a family I never knew I had lost, and forward into a future filled with a quiet, profound, and unexpected joy. In the quiet between us, there was no need for grand promises. The simple act of walking forward together, hand in hand, was enough.
Perhaps we will not see you again, so subscribe to this channel to listen to more interesting stories.